Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with The Golden Age of the Symphony, Volume 9, which actually goes back to the beginning of the Golden Century, which started in 1880 and ended in 1979, or 1980, roughly there, because that's when the great orchestras were largely founded and established all over Europe and North America and wherever else they are. That's when they really got going, and that's when the composers wrote the music for them to play. Now, of course, symphonists had been going for most of the 19th century, off and on, but it was not really a terrific time for symphonic composition until you got past mid-century. Sure, there was the first Viennese school, Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, and then the early Romantics, Mendelssohn and Schumann and those folk. But then there was this sort of fallow period historically. Of course, there was lots of stuff going on. Historically, we have to be realistic. Music history is winner's history. We talk about who the major people were. We don't necessarily talk about what the actual total sum of activity, good, bad, and indifferent was, because there was a lot of indifferent, actually, in this period, and some very good that we don't pay much attention to. But the second wave of great symphonic composition began in the second half of the 19th century, and it began with composers like Brahms and Dvořák and Tchaikovsky and all of those people, and they were maturing in the 1860s and 70s and 80s. So if we start in 1880, when most of the major orchestras were just getting established. The Concertgebouw was founded in the 1880s. The Berlin Philharmonic and those orchestras date from around the 1880s. The only earlier regularly constituted orchestras were the Paris Conservatory and the New York Phil and Vienna Phil from the 1840s. But even that's not so long before, you see. We needed to have a critical mass, a bunch of orchestras, so that a great work could be played in all of the major European capitals, for example, or all the major cities in specific countries. So that took some time. And by the 1880s, it was going like gangbusters, because there were both municipal orchestras that were supported by bourgeois music lovers, middle class, the rising middle class of merchants and cultural consumers, as well as the aristocratically funded and supported orchestras. It was a nice little mix there. And we begin. So for 1880 to 1889, we begin with Glazunov, Symphony No. 1 from 1881. Glazunov was a really good symphonist. People don't give him as much credit as he deserves. His 8 symphonies are splendid pieces, and the first he wrote when he was only 16. He was a remarkable, remarkable prodigy, and it's a work of total confidence and extraordinary freshness, and it kind of is symbolic that the golden age of the symphony begins in 1881 with the 16-year-old Glazunov, because there was so much more in the future than there had been in the past. Absolutely. Then, here's one you might not have heard of. Sgambati, the Italian composer, his Symphony No. 1 was also 1881. Now, he wrote 3 symphonies, 2 numbers 1, 2, and this sort of like wedding thing. It was really very pretty, programmatic symphony. He was a good composer, and his first symphony is a flat-out masterpiece, gorgeous, original 5-movement works, possibly loosely modeled on Schumann and that sort of school. Schumann was quite influential as a symphonist among other European composers. It's interesting how he was influential, because he was influential both as a writer and as a composer principally of piano works. But it's the piano works that were disseminated, because not everybody had the opportunity to hear the orchestral stuff. And so as a result of hearing the piano stuff, they heard his symphonies and took him as a model, which sort of was not a very good one, but that's another issue, isn't it? He was himself. And Sgambati doesn't sound anything like Schumann, but it's a big 5-movement symphony. It's got harps. It's gorgeous. It's absolutely fabulous. And then after Sgambati, 1883, Zdeněk Fibich, the contemporary of Dvořák, who only wrote 3 symphonies, and the first is his best. It really is. It's a lovely, lovely, enjoyable piece that's not entirely, it's not Czech nationalist in the way Dvořák is. You don't hear the tunes and go, ah, that's Czech. But then again, Dvořák was Czech the way Copland was American. In other words, they both kind of invented the style, which was later associated with their countries, but it was theirs. Sibelius was another one, too. Sibelius's style was Sibelius, and it later became known as Finnish. So Dvořák is identified with Czech music, Copland with American, Sibelius with Finnish, and Fibich, well, poor guy. He's just a good, solid composer in the Central European tradition, and he wrote an absolutely lovely first symphony in 1883. So let's just leave it at that. Then we'll jump to 1885. Bruckner, Symphony No. 7. He'd been going like all over the place since the 1860s, basically. He'd been chugging out symphonies that were all like monumental failures if they were performed at all. But the 7th was his breakthrough, his big breakthrough, and Nickisch conducted it and made a huge success with it. We all know it and love it. And that was 1885. Brahms also, his last symphony, Symphony No. 4, dates from 1884, 85. It's in that area, which is really, really interesting because, you've got this triumvirate of romantic nationalist composers who were symphonists, and they operated in the 20 years between, say, 1860 and the 1880s and 90s for the most part. And that was the beginning of the golden age of the symphony. It wasn't the end. It wasn't the end of anything. Well, it was the end of German symphonies, is what it was. But everywhere else, things were just dandy. Dvořák wrote his 7th symphony in 1885. 1885 was a great year. Wow. I mean, can you imagine if you had like tickets? You could go see the premieres of all these things. It would have been really something. They're all premiered in Vienna, or a lot of them were. I mean, some of them where they were played there anyway. So that's really, really juicy. That's quite a triumvirate. And then Saint-Saëns, Symphony No. 3, his organ symphony, 1886. Even outside of Central Europe, the German and Slavic and whatever lands, there was stuff happening, considerable stuff happening. And the Saint-Saëns organ symphony is, of course, magnificent. And that also took advantage of the new symphonic concert hall organs, specifically in Paris, the one at the Trocadero, which, is this giant concert hall, emporium place that had a fabulous Cavalier call organ and then that gave recitals regularly. Tchaikovsky, yeah, he was nearing the end of his career too. Symphony No. 5 comes from 1888. And that one is hugely, hugely popular. Tchaikovsky only had 1 symphony to go, but you've got to remember, Tchaikovsky wasn't very old. He wasn't very old when he died. I mean, he died of cholera. So, he was not an old man. Saint-Saëns was going to live into the 1920s. So these guys were in their ripe middle age when they were hitting their stride as symphonists. Franck, Symphony in D minor, his single symphony, and one of the great French symphonies. The French were starting to get into orchestral music and instrumental music, because previously the French musical culture consisted largely of theatrical music, ballet and opera, principally. And symphonies were rather few and far between. Chamber works were rather, rare, but it all started happening. It all started happening in the 1880s and 1870s and 80s in France. So the Franck D minor, and last but not least, the beginning of modernism, the 20th century as we know it, and 20th century symphonic orchestration. Mahler, Symphony No. 1, 1888. That was the original 5-movement tone poem / symphony version. Titan, he called it at various times. And he, of course, would tinker and revise, because he tinkered and revised with everything he ever did. But 1888, Mahler was there. And he was in at the beginning of the golden age of the symphony. So there you have it. And you can add your own if you'd like. And do not tell me, oh, I think such and such belongs on the list. This is my list. stop whining and make your own list. If you want something on the list, make a list. That's it. It's really easy. You can do it yourself. No problem. This isn't the one, the only, the definitive. It's not anything. It's just a list. And you have every right and the freedom, and I hope the enthusiasm to provide some of your own, because there are a lot of other symphonies I haven't talked about. I mean, there are all those not terribly interesting English ones, Stanford and Parry and those people, until Elgar got going, I mean, there's Sullivan's Irish Symphony. I don't know if that was the 1880s, but, there's a lot of really, really good stuff in here. And this is just 10 that I've chosen off the top of my head to show you, to illustrate just how splendid this decade was. And my God, what a decade. I mean, look at that list. Wow. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.